Hello everyone, welcome to Hopeful Moments 1. Today, we are going to listen to a story about understanding, financial independence, and complex family relationships. The main issue in this story revolves around conflicts within the family related to money and financial responsibility. The narrator's parents and brother seem to have expectations or demands for financial help, but the narrator, due to their own financial situation, cannot or does not want to meet those demands. Today's story will take you through a surprising situation. Instead of the anger or disdain that might have been expected in the past, the father seems to feel regret and failure, a surprising shift in his response compared to previous conflicts. If you find this story interesting and full of meaningful lessons, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more valuable lessons. The story begins when my parents, after a long period of no contact, tried to reconnect with me through social media. They asked me to meet them at a public place of my choice. Immediately, I felt like this was a trap. These suggestions weren't trivial, and I knew that when my parents reached out, there was surely something behind it. But what kept me from feeling fearful was the sense of amusement. I was no longer the easily manipulated person I used to be. They knew I wasn't someone who would fall into a trap, and I was fully confident in my decisiveness. I didn't feel worried at all. I was just curious to see what they wanted this time. A part of me just wanted to wait and see how things would unfold, as I had become so familiar with similar situations in the past. Deciding where to meet them wasn't hard. I chose a local restaurant, possibly named Olive Tree and Garden, where I felt comfortable and in control of the situation. Choosing a public space made me feel safer because I could easily walk away if things became tense. When I arrived, I found that Dan, my brother, was also there. But interestingly, throughout the meeting, he remained mostly silent. I couldn't tell if he was silent because he felt awkward or didn't know what to say in this situation. Regardless, his silence made the atmosphere more tense, and I couldn't help but feel a bit frustrated by it. Meanwhile, my parents kept repeating requests that I could predict, but I chose to remain silent and observe what they would say next. Everything seemed to evoke a sense of it being orchestrated, a meeting that wasn't truly random but had a clear purpose. But I also understood that this was my chance to show strength and not allow myself to be coerced. Whatever they wanted, I was mentally prepared to face it and not be swayed by emotions or manipulation from people who had hurt me before. This meeting was truly a challenge for me. Things started off tense from the moment we greeted each other. There was a bit of awkwardness, as if we were in an unwanted meeting. However, after those moments of uncomfortable silence, my parents and I ordered drinks and quickly got to the main issue. This made me feel like everything had been planned beforehand, and it was just waiting for me to react. My parents began by begging me to help Dan, asking me to support him in getting his own apartment to move out. At that moment, I truly understood that they were trying to rely on me to fix Dan's problems. They revealed that Dan's credit score was low, which was no surprise. In my mind, I wondered, why is his credit score so low? And immediately, an answer appeared in my head. Perhaps it's because his wife constantly spends all his money, with no budgeting plan. This was the main reason why he ended up in such a difficult financial situation. They asked me for help in two ways. One was to provide some funds for him to pay his rent, and the other was to co-sign the lease and help pay his rent. Both requests left me feeling confused and pressured. But I didn't hesitate to answer. I simply said no to both requests. Right at that moment, Dan started speaking, his voice full of anger. He shouted at me, saying that I had so much money, while he had a family to support, and that I should save money to help his family because I don't have a family. His words felt like a heavy blow to my heart. I couldn't sit there without reacting. I smiled sarcastically and asked them, "Where were you when I needed help?" That question wasn't just out of anger, but also a reflection of the truth I had faced. I couldn't forget the tough years when I was criticized and mocked for being homeless. At that time, they didn't show up to help me. In my mind, I thought about my childhood, memories of scarcity and loneliness. And part of me wanted to share those stories with everyone around me, so they would understand me better, the struggles I fought through alone. But just as I was about to speak, my mother grabbed my hand and begged me not to mention the past. I looked into her eyes, full of worry, as if she feared those words would make everything worse. My father and Dan both turned away, saying nothing. I could feel them suppressing their anger, perhaps wanting to say something like before, the criticism and reproach they usually aimed at me. But this time, they couldn't say it, because I was no longer the easily manipulated person I once was. Their silence made me realize that, not just me, but they too felt a bit awkward and insecure in this situation. This situation forced me to confront very complex emotions. It wasn't just anger, but also disappointment at how they had treated me in the past. But I didn't allow myself to be hurt anymore. I had learned how to protect myself and not let anyone take advantage of me, even if they were family. This story wasn't just a simple meeting, but a turning point in me realizing my own strength and self-control. When I asked my parents if they thought I was rich, a silence filled the room, and it felt as though everything around us quieted down. The question was spoken, and that silence was an undeniable sign. Their gaze was the answer, no words were needed. It was a look full of expectation, but also laced with doubt and skepticism, as if they were looking at an ideal image they had created in their minds. They expected me to be someone always ready to help, without calculations or concerns about my own finances, someone they could rely on any time, someone who could fulfill their demands and expectations without hesitation. But in that moment, I knew I wasn't that person. I wasn't the model they hoped for, and the reality was that I didn't have enough financial resources to meet those expectations. I thought they would understand that, but they still wanted me to be that person. The feeling of being misjudged, of being overly expected, weighed heavily on me. When I said that I didn't have enough money, the expressions on their faces said it all. They looked at me as if they were stunned, with surprise and disappointment clearly in their eyes. Their gaze was as though they were confronting an unacceptable truth, a shock that they were not prepared for. Perhaps, in their world, I was always the one capable of offering support, the one they could count on any time, anywhere. Yet now, I was the one who could not help, and that was a shock to them. I could feel their sense of lack in that gaze, a bit of disappointment because of a gap they couldn't explain. Maybe they didn't understand that I had been facing my own financial struggles, that I couldn't bear their burden without harming my own life. In their minds, I was always a bottomless pit of financial support, and when I couldn't provide, they couldn't accept this reality. They couldn't accept that I, the one they always saw as their financial pillar, was struggling with difficulties and had to take care of myself. This made me feel like an awakening, a realization coming too late. I realized that I wasn't just facing the overwhelming expectations of my family, but also a shift in our relationship. In the past, I could be the one they relied on, but now, I couldn't continue in that role. I needed to protect my own finances, and that wasn't selfish, it was necessary. However, no matter how I explained it, perhaps they still wouldn't understand. And this created an invisible gap between us, one that I wasn't sure I could bridge. That moment was not just a simple conversation, it was a turning point in how I viewed family relationships, the responsibilities, and expectations that we sometimes face, and that we cannot avoid. When I began explaining in detail how I had saved up to afford a house deposit, I realized I was sharing a story that wasn't easy. It wasn't a simple journey or just numbers on paper. To reach the required deposit, I had to sacrifice a lot. Those were the months I lived frugally, calculating every meal carefully, and my personal needs or hobbies were almost completely set aside. I worked tirelessly, sometimes with no time for myself or for the relationships around me. Every penny I earned had to be saved and used as optimally as possible, all to achieve one grand goal, owning my own home. When I finally had enough for the deposit, I felt like I had achieved a part of my dream. But that joy wasn't complete. More than ever, I realized that I hadn't escaped my financial struggles. I couldn't fully rejoice, because I was still battling with life, with the endless daily expenses. Although I had a steady income, most of that money had to go into savings so that I could continue living without being swept up in the cycle of debt, without sinking back into the financial difficulties I had worked so hard to escape from. When I asked Dan about his annual salary, I couldn't help but notice the disparity between his income and mine. When he answered, I couldn't hold back the lump in my throat. Although his salary was a little higher than mine, what surprised and unsettled me was that despite earning well, he still couldn't manage his own life. He was still struggling with financial management and had to rely on others to maintain his life, something I couldn't comprehend. That lump in my throat wasn't just because of the income difference, but because I realized that it was often the decisions and financial management of each person that determined their stability and independence, not just the amount of money they made. Right then, I started to break down my finances in detail. I didn't just speak, I used simple calculations right in front of my parents to show them my real situation. Around 70% of my monthly income was allocated to fixed payments like mortgage loans, insurance, gas, internet, phone bills, food, and other bills. Each month, I had to manage these expenses, with almost nothing left over for personal expenditures or long-term plans. Only about 30% of my income could be saved, and even that had to be used for very urgent purposes, like creating an emergency fund. This analysis wasn't to prove that I was in a worse situation than anyone else, but to make my parents understand that my financial life was not simple and could not be spent on anyone but myself. That savings fund was my only protection, the assurance for unpredictable risks in the future. It wasn't just money I could spend on temporary pleasures, but a way for me to maintain my life, ensuring that I wouldn't fall into the same financial difficulties I had before. This not only showed the difficulty of managing personal finances but also served as a reminder of the value of independence and self-sufficiency in life. Even though I had a steady income, the reality was that I wasn't well off, and I couldn't help everyone as they expected. I didn't forget to tell them about my old truck, the one I had been using since the 90s. That was one of the few assets I owned, but also a potential risk I couldn't neglect. The truck wasn't just a simple mode of transportation, it was a vital part of my life, something I depended on every day to continue working, to maintain my stability. But it was also full of risks. The truck was old, and any time it broke down, I would face unforeseen costs, possibly repairs or, worse, replacing it with a new one, which would put me in financial trouble again. Not to mention the other costs I had to deal with, home repairs, medical bills, taxes, lawyers, and numerous emergency expenses that no one could predict. These things could happen at any moment, and I couldn't afford to risk my finances on these unpredictable situations. So, although I wanted to help Dan, I knew that I couldn't do it. I couldn't empty everything I had to help someone who couldn't manage their own life, especially when I was still trying to maintain my own stability. The price of helping could be too high for me to pay, and I refused to sign any contract because it wouldn't just affect me, but it would also make me liable for debts that Dan might not be able or willing to repay. And at that moment, I pointed out a truth that my parents couldn't deny. The main reason they had never signed a lease agreement for Dan was because they realized that it wouldn't protect them, and they didn't want to face the financial risks that Dan might bring. I knew this wouldn't be easy for them to accept, but I had to speak the truth. Immediately after that, my mother began to cry. This scene wasn't just an emotional reaction, but an intense moment where I realized that even though I had valid reasons to refuse, to them, it was still a deep disappointment. What I did wasn't because I didn't love them, but because I had to protect myself. For them, what I had just said might have been a shock, because they didn't fully understand the financial pressure I had been under all this time. They might have felt hurt, feeling that their son was no longer there to support them, to be the one they could rely on when facing difficulties. But for me, it was a necessary decision, a tough yet essential one to protect my own financial stability and future. This was the moment I realized that we can't always meet the expectations of our family, especially when those expectations cross the line of self-protection. This situation was not just a simple conversation about money or helping, but a tense confrontation between family expectations and personal decisions. It clearly showed my shift from being someone easily exploited to someone who knows how to stand up and protect their rights, even if that makes the family feel hurt and disappointed. I realized that not all love can come with unconditional sacrifice, especially when it threatens my own stability. I was almost always one step ahead of them in all of this. I'm not an ATM, and I'm not a fool, and I told them that straight to their faces. I had hoped that my father would get angry as usual, would explode and scold me for not helping my brother, as he had done throughout my life. But this time he didn't do that. This time, he just remained silent. There was no trace of disdain on his face. His eyes could only be described in one word: regret. Regret for past mistakes? Or regret because he couldn't manipulate me anymore? I couldn't know for sure, but I understood that, in this moment, I had done something I had never done before. I had stood firm, protected myself, and I was no longer the son who could be manipulated. Although I could feel the hurt in their eyes, I also knew that this was a big step in my life. I couldn't always be the obedient son, always willing to sacrifice myself to please the family. Sometimes, love is not about blind acceptance, but the ability to stand up for yourself and create your own life. No matter what happened, I knew one thing for sure: my parents couldn't argue with me on this matter, and I had no intention of giving them any money. My determination made the atmosphere more tense, but I felt that I had to protect my financial stability from unreasonable demands. Dan, as a reaction of anger, stood up and declared that all these conversations were just a waste of time, and he was leaving. My mother began to apologize on his behalf, but Dan, with a determined look, still decided to leave. This was the moment I realized that, even though I tried to maintain a peaceful atmosphere, sometimes rejection and differences in perspectives cannot be reconciled. To avoid making things more tense, I tried to end the meeting lightly. I suggested buying them unlimited soup and salad while we were still there. I guessed they couldn't refuse free food, especially when we hadn't ordered anything except drinks. After hearing my suggestion, they agreed to stay. This was a small way for me to show that, even though things weren't going smoothly, I was still willing to maintain the relationship, even if it was only in this way. As the meal started, I tried to steer the conversation away from money matters, avoiding any financial tension. Dan remained silent, partly because he was eating, and partly because he probably had no interest in the conversation. On the other hand, my parents kept talking to me, but I could feel their awkwardness in every word they spoke. They told me about joining a local Christian church and having attended for 2 weeks. I simply replied, "That's great." But they didn't stop there, trying to invite me to join them. I just declined, and luckily they were thoughtful enough not to press further. This showed a shift in our relationship, as they no longer imposed their will on me. When the meal ended, Dan left a $10 bill on the table as a tip and walked out without saying another word. His action wasn't really surprising, but it did reflect some coldness in our relationship. My mother once again tried to justify his actions, but I didn't want to participate in that justification anymore. We parted ways, not with as much tension or drama as I had imagined earlier. This meeting ended quickly, without excessive resistance, but a part of me felt a little reflection, as I knew that what had been said was not easy to digest. Still, even though this meeting had ended, I couldn't stop thinking about my sister-in-law. She often complained on social media about my parents. It seemed she wasn't satisfied with her place in the family, feeling like she wasn't prioritized, but rather pushed aside. This was something I could understand, but the toxicity in her attitude had begun to affect my parents. She wanted my parents to completely change to make space for her, and it seemed they were too desperate to reconnect with me. My mother had repeatedly rejected her request to move into the trailer where I used to live. But this change wasn't easy for them. She truly wanted my parents to become tools to serve her family, without realizing that family should only be a place of mutual help, not a service organization. And while I no longer cared about online arguments or unreasonable criticism from strangers, I couldn't help but feel a bit uncomfortable with the constant calls from people I didn't know. Some even called from different numbers just to harass me about giving up my house for my sister-in-law. But I didn't let that affect me anymore. I just blocked them and carried on with my life. Although there was one persistent harasser calling from different numbers, I made it clear to them that continuing these calls only amused me, because I knew they were trying to confuse and annoy me. Eventually, the calls gradually stopped, and the last time I received one was at the beginning of this month, and after that, there were no more calls. Life can be full of challenges and stress, but I know that I did the right thing. Even though I couldn't please everyone, I found a way to protect myself from exploitation and preserve what was important to me. In the end, this family meeting left me with deep reflections on our relationship. Although I tried to keep the situation from getting too tense, I also realized that sometimes, setting boundaries and saying no is an important part of protecting yourself and the values you are trying to build. Family can bring expectations and pressure, but we are the ones who have the right to decide how we want to live and face challenges. The lesson learned from this experience is, in life, sometimes we have to make difficult decisions, especially when we are faced with a choice between maintaining a relationship or protecting ourselves and our finances. Knowing how to say no firmly, even if it may hurt others, is also a way to maintain stability and freedom in our lives. Protecting independence and not letting ourselves become tools for others' exploitation is not a selfish act, but a necessary one to preserve mental health and self-respect.